Sometimes, disaster doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, disguised as excitement, and strikes when you least expect it. That's exactly how this date unfolded. At first, it felt like the beginning of something real, something extraordinary. But by the end, I was left questioning how I could have been so wrong. We met online, as so many of these stories go. For a week, we talked nonstop, morning, noon, and night. The kind of conversations that flow effortlessly, where every message feels like a step closer to understanding someone who just gets you. I'd never felt an instant connection like that before. It was like we'd known each other for years, as if the universe had aligned just to bring us together. By the time Friday rolled around, I was buzzing with anticipation. We agreed to meet for dinner at a restaurant he'd chosen. I dressed carefully, not overly formal but not too casual either, just the right blend of effort and ease. When I arrived, I spotted him through the window, waving at me with a broad smile. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. But the moment I walked in, the first crack appeared. He barely glanced up from the menu. No warm greeting, no compliment, not even the courtesy of eye contact. It threw me off, but I brushed it aside, telling myself he might just be nervous. After all, first dates can be intimidating. As I sat down and opened the menu, my stomach sank. The place wasn't halal. A part of me felt embarrassed for assuming. It was our shared faith, after all, so I thought it went without saying. But I kept calm, scanning for a vegetarian option. When I asked the waitress if the risotto could be made without wine, she was understanding and accommodating. I thought the awkward moment had passed. Then he ordered a bottle of wine. He poured himself a glass, holding it up toward me with a grin. "Come on," he urged, sloshing the liquid around. "You're missing out. Just one glass." "I'm good with water, thanks," I replied politely, trying to mask my discomfort. He shrugged, took a long sip, and smirked as if he knew something I didn't. The conversation, which had been so vibrant over text, felt stilted and forced in person. I tried to steer things to safer ground, bringing up light-hearted topics. But then he brought up his drug experiences, casually dropping stories about his past adventures with substances, like he was reliving a fond memory. It wasn't long before the evening took an even darker turn. Midway through his second glass of wine, he started complaining about the waitress. "What's her problem?" he muttered, slurring slightly. "She hasn't smiled once. She's such a bitch." I stared at him, stunned. Sure, the waitress wasn't overly bubbly, but why would she need to be? She was doing her job, and I'd found her perfectly polite. His anger felled out of nowhere, and it left me wondering what kind of person reacts like that. Then came the games. The restaurant had little get-to-know-each-other cards for diners, and I thought they might help salvage the evening. But every question I answered was wrong in his eyes. He'd rephrase them, dig deeper, or press me to give answers that fit his narrative. It was exhausting. He was dissatisfied with everything I said, like I was some project he was trying to mold into his ideal. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, he started talking about his ex. "She didn't want to raise our kids as Muslims," he said, swirling his wine lazily before taking another sip. "That's why it ended." I blinked at him, unsure how to respond. I wanted to point out the glaring irony of his statement, given the wine bottle in front of him and the stories he'd just shared. But I didn't. I just nodded and stayed quiet, hoping the night would end soon. As the restaurant began to close, we decided to take a walk. Or rather, I decided to humor him for just a little longer. He grabbed his bottle of wine, tucking it under his arm like it was a precious keepsake. "I need to take a work call," he said after a few minutes of strolling. He set the bottle down next to me and walked away, phone pressed to his ear. To add to my discomfort, he lit a cigarette as he paced, puffing away while old aunties passing by shot me disapproving looks. I shifted uneasily, and when he returned, he scolded me for leaving the bottle unattended. "It's fine," I said, trying to defuse the situation. "Nobody's going to take it." He sat down beside me again, this time pulling out a vape pen. Without warning, he took a deep puff and blew the smoke straight into my face. I coughed, recoiling in surprise. "Oops," he said with a laugh. "That was an accident." By then I was done. Done with the arrogance, the lack of respect, the complete disregard for my comfort. And yet, he had one more parting gift to deliver. "You're really not my type, you know," he said casually, his words dripping with disdain. "You're too goody two-shoes for me." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. "I'm not your type." I wanted to laugh. Not because it wasn't true. He clearly wanted someone who'd share his vices and tolerate his behavior. But because it was such a petty, meaningless thing to say. It was the nail in the coffin of an already doomed night. I booked a grab on the spot. When it arrived, I didn't bother saying goodbye. I just got in and left. The next day, I expected him to apologize, to at least acknowledge how poorly the date had gone. Instead, he ghosted me. No message, no explanation, just silence. And honestly, it was the best thing he could have done. Looking back, I laugh at the absurdity of it all. The wine, the insults, the audacity of vaping in my face. But more than anything, I laugh at how he thought ghosting me was a punishment. If anything, it was a gift. It started like any other attempt at finding a connection. A swipe, a match, a few pleasant messages exchanged. He seemed charming, polite even. Enough to make me lower my guard just a little. Enough to agree to meet him in person. The chill of the evening air greeted me as I stepped out to meet him. The streetlights flickered faintly above the quiet pathway where we'd agreed to meet. It was one of those evenings where everything feels like a question. The kind of night where the darkness seems alive, whispering warnings you're too distracted to hear. And when I saw him standing there just ahead, hands jammed into his pockets, I ignored the prickling unease in my gut. "Hey," he greeted me, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I smiled back, still trying to convince myself this was a good idea. We started walking, the conversation light and casual at first. But it didn't take long for the mask to slip. "So," he said after a few minutes, his tone almost too casual, "why don't we grab something to eat? I skipped lunch today." It was an odd way to start, but I brushed it off. "Sure, I know a place nearby." We found a small diner that wasn't too crowded, and we slid into a booth by the window. As I scanned the menu, he leaned back, arms spread across the booth like he owned the place. "Actually," he said, "you don't mind covering this, do you? I forgot my wallet at home." I froze. He hadn't mentioned that before, and the way he asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, caught me off guard. I didn't want to seem rude, so I forced a smile. Yeah, I guess that's fine." The food arrived, but I barely tasted it. I was too busy watching him wolf down his meal, barely coming up for air. He talked the whole time, but I wasn't really listening. My thoughts were spinning. Was he taking advantage of me? Or was I overreacting? When the check came, he didn't even glance at it. I paid, feeling the sting of disappointment bubbling under my skin. Still, I thought maybe this was just a rough start. Maybe he'd redeem himself. But the night was far from over. As we left the diner and resumed our walk, he turned to me abruptly. "Listen," he began, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Can you lend me 20 euros? I'm in a bit of a bind right now." My heart sank. This was turning into some bizarre hustle. "I don't know," I said hesitantly. I wasn't planning to carry much cash with me tonight. His face darkened, but he quickly replaced it with a tight smile. "No worries," he said, though the tension in his voice was impossible to miss. I should have ended it there. I should have walked away. But instead, I kept walking, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe he wasn't as bad as he seemed. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. But the night had other plans. A little while later, he stopped in his tracks. "Oh, by the way," he said, as if he'd just remembered something important. "Can you cover my bus fare? I'll pay you back later." I stared at him, my patience wearing thin. "Seriously?" He shrugged. "Yeah, just a couple of euros. It's not a big deal, right?" At this point, I was too exhausted to argue. "Fine," I muttered, handing him the fare. It wasn't the money that bothered me, it was the audacity. The sheer entitlement. When we finally reached the bus stop, I made up my mind. I was done. "I'll just get a taxi home," I said, fishing out my phone to call for one. His eyes lit up. "Oh, a taxi? My place is on the way. Mind dropping me off?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe I thought it was the easiest way to get rid of him. Maybe I just wanted the night to end. But as the taxi pulled up and we climbed in, his demeanor shifted again. He leaned back in his seat, eyeing me suspiciously. "You're just trying to figure out where I live, aren't you?" he accused suddenly, his voice sharp and accusing. I blinked, stunned. "What? No. Why would I care where you live?" "Don't lie," he snapped. "You're trying to stalk me or something, aren't you?" The absurdity of it all hit me like a slap in the face. I stared at him, struggling to find the words. "I offered to drop you off as a favor. If you think I'm stalking you, you can walk the rest of the way." His expression twisted, a mix of anger and embarrassment, but he didn't respond. The silence in the taxi was suffocating, and I could feel the driver's eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror, probably wondering what he'd gotten himself into. When we finally reached his stop, he didn't thank me. He didn't say a word. He just slammed the door and disappeared into the night. As the taxi drove away, I sat there in stunned silence, replaying the night in my head. What had I just experienced? It wasn't a date. It wasn't even a bad date. It was something darker, something stranger. A twisted game where I was the unwitting player. When I finally got home, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. I'd been duped, manipulated, treated like some kind of free meal ticket. But more than that, I felt violated. Like I'd let someone step into my life and trample all over my trust. I don't know what his intentions were that night. Maybe he thought he was being clever. Maybe he'd done this to others before me. Or maybe he was just another lost soul, desperate and floundering, trying to take what he could from whoever crossed his path. Whatever the case, I learned something that night. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And sometimes, the real horror isn't in the shadows or the things that go bump in the night. It's in the people we let get too close. I still remember the way the fluorescent lights buzzed in the shop, the smell of fresh cardboard and faint perfume wafting from customers as they passed by. It was the usual chaos of a busy retail shift, customers asking for discounts, tills jamming at the worst moments, and the endless drone of pop music on repeat. But what kept me going, what made those long hours bearable, was the walk to work. Not because of the journey itself, but because of her. She worked in the boutique across the street. I didn't even know her name at first, but her presence was magnetic. She had this effortless confidence, a casual kind of beauty that left you fumbling for excuses to linger near her shop. I'd pass by, stealing glances, occasionally brave enough to toss her a wave. Sometimes she'd wave back, a small smile playing at her lips. That smile, it had a way of staying with me, following me into my shifts, lighting up the dullest moments. It took months to work up the courage to talk to her properly. The idea of rejection had kept me at bay, but one day something clicked. I was tired of just wondering what if. So, on a gray afternoon, as I saw her arranging the window display, I stopped. Heart pounding, palms sweating, I stepped inside. "Hi," I said, my voice shaking just enough to make me hate myself. "Would you, maybe want to grab a drink sometime?" She looked up, her face unreadable for a moment, and then she smiled. "Sure," she said casually, as though I hadn't just thrown my entire sense of self-worth into the question. "How about after work?" I floated through my shift, barely able to focus. The idea of drinks with her felt surreal, like some distant dream had suddenly decided to come true. I imagined charming conversations, shared laughter, the beginning of something real. But reality had other plans. When I arrived at the pub that evening, she was already there, sitting at the bar. Her legs were crossed, one foot bouncing slightly to the beat of the music, and her eyes lit up when she saw me. For a moment, I thought, this is it. This is my moment. "Hey," she greeted me, her voice warm and inviting. I already ordered us a couple of drinks. I joined her, and for the first half hour, everything felt perfect. We talked about work, music, the nightmare customers we both dealt with daily. She laughed at my jokes, and I felt like the luckiest guy in the room. But then something shifted. She downed her pint in a matter of minutes and ordered another. Then another. By the time I was halfway through my first, she'd already moved on to shots. "Vodka," she declared, slamming a glass onto the bar. "You in?" I hesitated. "I'll stick to beer," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Suit yourself," she replied, grinning as she tossed the shot back like it was water. At first, it seemed harmless, even funny. She was letting loose, having a good time. But as the drinks kept coming, I realized this wasn't just casual fun. Her words began to slur, her movements turning clumsy. She giggled at nothing, her head tipping back as if the ceiling had just told her the best joke she'd ever heard. By the time an hour had passed, she was on her fifth pint and God knows how many shots. I watched, helpless, as the girl I'd admired from afar transformed into a blur of chaos. She leaned over the bar to shout for more vodka, ignoring the bartender's raised brow and my growing concern. "Hey," I said gently, "maybe we should slow down a bit." She waved me off. "I'm fine," she slurred, her voice rising above the chatter around us. "You worry too much." Then mid-sentence she froze. Her head dipped forward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought she'd simply passed out right there at the bar. But she jolted back up, blinking furiously, and laughed like it was all some big joke. I didn't laugh. This wasn't funny anymore. When she finally did pass out, it wasn't dramatic. There was no collapse, no dramatic stumble. One moment she was talking, something about a holiday in Spain, and the next, her head was slumped forward, her arms limp at her sides. "Hey," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't respond. The bartender gave me a look that said, "Get her out of here," and I scrambled to figure out what to do. I couldn't just leave her. "Let me call you a cab," I muttered, more to myself than to her. Getting her into the taxi was a nightmare. She was dead weight, her body unresponsive as I half carried, half dragged her through the door. The driver raised an eyebrow, but didn't say a word as I heaved her onto the back seat. "What address?" he asked flatly. I didn't even know where she lived. My heart sank as I rummaged through her bag, hoping to find something, an ID, a piece of mail, anything. Finally, I found her phone. The screen lit up with a missed call from Dad. I hesitated, then pressed the number. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Hi," I said quickly. "This is, I'm with your daughter. She's not in great shape. I'm bringing her home." There was a long pause. Then, with a resigned sigh, he said, "I'll meet you at the door." The taxi ride felt endless. She slumped against the door, her breath shallow but steady. I kept glancing at her, torn between anger and worry. How had the night turned into this? When we finally reached her house, her father was waiting on the porch. His face was hard, etched with frustration. As I helped her out of the car, he shook his head. "For fuck's sake," he muttered, catching her under one arm. Again. The word hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't a one-off. This was a pattern, a reality I'd been too naive to see. I stood there for a moment, watching as he carried her inside without another word. The door shut behind them, leaving me alone on the porch, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I walked home that night, the cold air biting at my skin. The excitement, the nerves, the hope, it had all turned to ash. I'd wanted a story to tell, but not like this. Never like this. You'd think coffee dates are safe. Neutral territory. Public. No pressure. Just two people, sharing a drink and a conversation. Harmless, right? That's what I thought. I'd been wrong about many things before, but that day, I was about to discover just how wrong I could be. It was a crisp afternoon, the kind where the sky stretches out endlessly, bright and sharp, a perfect backdrop for possibilities. I had met her online, a few messages here, a laugh there. She seemed normal enough, smart and a little quirky, someone who could hold a good conversation. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already there, sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked up as I approached, and her smile was wide and inviting. "Hi," she said, standing to greet me. There was a warmth in her voice that put me at ease, and for the first time in a while, I felt like this could actually go somewhere. We started talking, the usual small talk at first, work, hobbies, how much we both hated the price of coffee these days. She laughed at my jokes, and her eyes crinkled in a way that made her seem approachable, genuine. I started to relax, sipping my drink and letting the conversation flow. But then she asked a question that shifted the tone of the entire afternoon. "So, how many serious relationships have you been in?" she asked, her head tilted slightly, her expression suddenly more focused. I hesitated. It wasn't a secret or anything, but I wasn't sure it was first date material. Still, I answered honestly. "Just one," I said, setting my cup down. "It lasted 7 years." Her eyebrows shot up. 7 years? That's a long time. "Yeah," I admitted, feeling a twinge of awkwardness. "We met in school. We were young, and it just lasted. But, life happens. We grew apart." She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. "And you haven't been in a serious relationship since?" "Nope. Just casual dating here and there, nothing that really stuck." I shrugged, trying to steer the conversation back to her. "What about you?" She ignored the question entirely, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her mug. "You were together for 7 years, she said, her tone almost contemplative. "That's not just a relationship. That's a soul tie." I blinked, not quite sure how to respond. I guess we were close, but it didn't work out, so... "No," she interrupted, her voice firmer now. "You don't just walk away from something like that. 7 years is destiny." I laughed awkwardly, assuming she was joking. "Yeah, well, destiny had other plans." Her face didn't change. If anything, her expression grew more intense, her eyes narrowing, as if she were seeing something I couldn't. "You don't understand," she said, leaning forward slightly. "People spend their whole lives searching for a connection like that. And you just walked away." "It wasn't that simple," I said, shifting uncomfortably in my seat. The way she was looking at me now, like I was some kind of puzzle she needed to solve. Set me on edge. We weren't happy anymore. We wanted different things. That doesn't matter, she said, her voice rising slightly. A few heads turned in our direction, and I could feel the weight of their glances. What matters is that you had it. You had your person. Your destiny. I laughed again, this time more out of disbelief than anything else. Look, I don't know about destiny, but we broke up for a reason. It's been years. We've both moved on. Her eyes widened, almost as if I'd slapped her. Moved on, she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. You're sitting here, telling me you've only ever had one real relationship, and you're trying to convince me you've moved on? No. No way. I opened my mouth to respond, but she cut me off, her words spilling out in a rush. You don't need to be here, she said, gesturing between us. You shouldn't be on dates or talking to new people. You need to stop all of this and go back to her. She's your destiny. Don't you see that? Her intensity hit me like a freight train. The warm, easygoing woman I'd met only an hour ago had vanished, replaced by someone who spoke like she was delivering a divine prophecy. I stared at her, stunned into silence. You've made a mistake, she continued, her voice unwavering. And it's not too late to fix it. You owe it to yourself, to her, to the universe. I couldn't help it, I laughed. A sharp, humorless sound that drew more curious glances from the other patrons. Are you serious right now? I asked, leaning back in my chair. You're telling me to stop dating and go back to someone I haven't been with in years because you think she's my destiny? Yes, she said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. I stared at her, half expecting her to crack a smile and admit this was all some kind of elaborate joke. But she didn't. She just sat there, staring at me like she could will me into agreement through sheer force of belief. For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. This was supposed to be a coffee date, a simple, no-pressure way to meet someone new. Instead, I'd been roped into some bizarre spiritual intervention. Okay, I said finally, standing up and grabbing my coat. I think this has been enlightening. But I'm going to go. She stood up too, her expression a mix of frustration and pity. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice following me as I walked toward the door. You can't run from destiny forever. I didn't respond. I didn't even look back. I just kept walking, the sound of the bell over the door ringing in my ears as I stepped out into the street. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the surreal encounter. I couldn't stop laughing as I walked away, the kind of laughter that bubbles up when you don't know what else to do. Destiny? Soul ties? What kind of person tells a complete stranger to abandon their life and go chasing after the past? I'd expected bad dates before, awkward silences, mismatched vibes, but this was something else entirely. By the time I got home, the humor of it had worn off, replaced by a strange unease. Her words echoed in my mind, uninvited and persistent. Maybe it wasn't her belief in destiny that bothered me. Maybe it was the fact that, for a split second, I'd almost believed her. I'll never forget my first Tinder date. Not because it was romantic or magical, but because it was a collision of chaos and absurdity that nearly made me delete the app forever. It was about 6 years ago. Tinder was still the shiny new thing, and I figured why not give it a shot. After a bit of swiping and casual banter, I matched with a woman who seemed decent enough. Her photos weren't overly polished, her smile was inviting, and she had a love for Thai food, something we bonded over almost immediately. I was new to the whole online dating thing, but I thought I'd hit the jackpot. So I did what any hopeful romantic would do. I made a dinner reservation at a cozy little restaurant downtown. When I arrived, the place was buzzing with soft chatter and clinking glasses. I spotted her sitting at a corner table, scrolling through her phone. At first, I hesitated, thinking I might have approached the wrong person. She looked nothing like her photos. I mean, not in the filters hide a few blemishes way, but in the am I being catfished way. Still, I decided to be polite. First dates are nerve-wracking enough without someone pointing out mismatched expectations right away. I plastered on a smile, introduced myself, and sat down. Maybe I thought her personality would shine brighter than her profile pictures had promised. For a brief moment, things were fine. We exchanged the usual small talk, and I felt myself relaxing, until the conversation veered into dangerous territory. So what brings you to Tinder? I asked, genuinely curious. She exhaled dramatically, leaning back in her chair. Well, it's kind of a crazy story, she said, her voice heavy with intrigue. I had a really bad breakup recently. I nodded, bracing myself for the details. It turns out, she continued, my boyfriend's girlfriend told me he was actually married. I blinked. Wait, what? Yeah, she said, casually sipping her water as if she'd just told me she preferred cats over dogs. I was dating this guy who had a girlfriend and a wife. I couldn't speak for a moment, trying to process what I'd just heard. And you didn't know? Of course not, she said indignantly. He looked so young. I never would have guessed he was married, let alone 50. I paused, trying to decide which part of this story to unpack first. 50? How old are you again? 31, she replied. But honestly, he didn't even look 50. He was so well kept. Here, let me show you a picture. She pulled out her phone and swiped to a photo. The man staring back at me wasn't 50. He was at least 60, with thinning gray hair and a face that had seen more years than his gym membership could hide. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but it must have slipped because she frowned. Okay, maybe he looked his age, she admitted. But I really didn't know about the wife and girlfriend. That's quite a situation, I managed, my appetite quickly evaporating. The date trudged on, each new detail of her personal life making me want to bolt for the door. By the time dessert rolled around, I knew I wasn't going to see her again. There's a certain level of drama I can tolerate, but finding yourself tangled in a web of relationships with a man who could have been your dad, that was a hard pass. When the check arrived, I decided to rip off the Band-Aid. Look, I said, keeping my tone as kind as possible, I really appreciate meeting you, but I don't think this is going to work out. I'd rather be upfront about it than ghost you. She stared at me for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then shrugged. Okay, she said lightly, as if I'd just declined a second helping of dessert. Relieved, I paid the bill and walked out, thinking I'd handled the situation well. But as I waited for my grab at the curb, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see her standing there, her arms crossed. So, she said, as if we were picking up right where we left off, where am I going? I stared at her, confused. What do you mean? Like, where are we going? She clarified. Are we grabbing drinks or heading to your place? I blinked, completely thrown. No, I said slowly, I'm going to my home, and you're going to your home. To emphasize, I used my hands, pointing them in opposite directions. Her face fell slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me with the uneasy feeling that this wasn't over. The next morning, I was enjoying a quiet cup of coffee when my doorbell rang. At first, I thought it might be a delivery, but when I checked the video feed, my stomach dropped. There she was, standing on my porch, looking far too comfortable for someone who'd been told, quite clearly, that there wouldn't be a second date. Her face was red, and she was shouting something into the camera. I pressed the intercom button. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice sharp with disbelief. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes brimming with tears. Why didn't you text me? She demanded. I thought we had a connection. I sighed, my patience fraying. I told you last night, we're not seeing each other again. I was upfront about it. Her expression crumpled, and she started sobbing. Right there on my porch, like some tragic figure in a bad romantic comedy. But why? She wailed. I don't understand. I stared at the screen, torn between frustration and disbelief. Look, I said, my tone far less polite now. This isn't going to change anything. Please go home. She continued crying, but I was done. I turned off the video feed and walked away, hoping that would be the end of it. Thankfully, it was. She never showed up again. That was my introduction to online dating. It taught me two things. Always vet your matches carefully, and never use your home address as your work address. Some people just don't take no for an answer. It started with a match on one of those apps. Swipe left, swipe right, the roulette of modern romance. Her profile caught my attention right away. She had a warm smile, an easygoing vibe, and a love for food, which she'd highlighted in her bio with pictures of elaborate dishes and cozy cafe settings. She seemed like someone who'd appreciate a casual lunch date, so I took the leap and asked her out. To my surprise, she agreed. We picked a trendy little bistro downtown. I arrived early, as I tend to do, and found us a corner table with a good view of the bustling street outside. When she walked in, I couldn't help but smile. She looked just like her pictures, better, even. There was an air of confidence about her that immediately put me at ease. She greeted me with a quick hug and sat down, her bag slipping off her shoulder as she settled into the chair. The first 10 minutes were pleasant enough. We exchanged small talk, The usual questions: work, hobbies, how many disastrous dates we'd both endured to land here. She laughed at one of my jokes, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and I thought to myself, this is going well. But then something shifted. She started glancing at her phone more frequently, her eyes flicking down to the screen, as if she were waiting for some urgent news. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she had work notifications, or a text she couldn't ignore. I kept the conversation going, doing my best to hold her attention. So, I asked, trying to steer things back to neutral ground, what's the best meal you've ever had? She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten I was there. Huh. Oh, probably sushi, she replied absently, before her gaze dropped back to her phone. Her enthusiasm from earlier was gone, replaced by a vague sense of distraction. Everything okay? I asked, forcing a smile. You seem a bit preoccupied. No, it's fine, she said quickly, pocketing her phone. Sorry about that. What were you saying? I tried to pick up the thread of conversation, but the flow was gone. Her energy had shifted completely, and every few minutes, her eyes would drift back to the window or down to her lap, as if she were searching for an escape. Then, out of nowhere, she straightened in her seat. Oh my God, she said, her tone sharp with urgency. I just remembered. I have a group meeting I completely forgot about. I blinked, taken aback. A meeting? Right now? Yeah, she said, already gathering her things. Her movements were quick, practiced, as though she'd done this before. I'm so sorry. I really have to go. Before I could respond, she was on her feet, slinging her bag over her shoulder. She didn't offer an apology beyond the hurried explanation, didn't even look me in the eye. Do you wanna? I started, but she cut me off. Thanks for lunch, she said, already halfway to the door. And just like that, she was gone. I sat there, stunned, staring at the half-eaten plate of food she'd left behind. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I said something wrong? Done something to offend her? Or was this her plan all along? A quick escape from a date she'd lost interest in? The waiter came by, awkwardly clearing her plate while giving me a sympathetic look. Another drink? He asked, his voice tinged with pity. No, I'm fine, I muttered, though I didn't feel fine. I finished my meal alone, every bite tasting a little more bitter than the last. The vibrant atmosphere of the bistro now felt suffocating, each cheerful laugh or clink of a glass a cruel reminder of how this date had gone so completely off the rails. Later that evening, after stewing in my own thoughts for hours, I decided to reach out. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe something had genuinely come up, and I'd misread the situation. Hey, I typed, keeping the message light and neutral. Just checking in. Is everything okay? I hope I didn't say or do anything to upset you. I sent the message, watching the little sent icon turn into delivered. Then I waited, and waited, and waited. Nothing. No reply. No acknowledgement. Just a cold, deafening silence. The next day, I checked my phone again, hoping for some sign of a response. Still nothing. At first, I felt confused, then embarrassed, and finally angry. If she wasn't interested, fine. But to just walk out like that, without so much as an apology or explanation, it felt cruel, like my time and effort had meant nothing. I deleted her number that night, along with the app. The whole experience left me questioning why I'd even bothered in the first place. Maybe I'd just been unlucky. Maybe online dating wasn't for me. Or maybe this was just the reality of modern romance. A world where people swipe, ghost, and vanish without a second thought, leaving others to pick up the pieces of their dashed expectations. Even now, years later, I think about that date sometimes. Not because it hurt, though it did, in its own way, but because it taught me something valuable. Respect isn't a lot to ask for. It costs nothing to be honest, to say, I'm not feeling it, or even to finish a meal politely before leaving. And yet, for some people, that's too much. The next time I went on a date, I carried that lesson with me. Not everyone you meet will be kind, but you can choose to be. And if someone decides to leave you sitting at a table, awkward and alone, well, that says more about them than it ever will about you. When I matched with her online, it felt like one of those rare moments when everything just clicks. She was smart, funny, and gorgeous in a way that made you forget the world around you. Within hours of chatting, we decided to meet. No pretense, no games, just raw, magnetic chemistry. That night was everything. The conversation was easy, the laughter unforced. One drink turned into two, and before long, we found ourselves at my place, wrapped up in the kind of connection that feels too good to be true. I'll spare you the details, but let's just say it was the kind of night that leaves you replaying moments in your head for days after. The next morning, as I walked her to her car, she hugged me tight, her lips brushing my ear. "We should do this again soon," she said, her voice soft but certain. I couldn't agree more. But life had other plans. I was set to leave on a work trip that weekend. 3 weeks on the road, flying across cities, meetings back to back. I told her, half expecting her to lose interest. Most people wouldn't bother keeping in touch with someone they'd just met, especially under those circumstances. But she surprised me. Every day while I was away, she messaged. Long texts, little check-ins, jokes that made me laugh in crowded airport lounges. She told me how much she missed me, how she couldn't wait to see me again. It was flattering, sure, but it also felt genuine. She wasn't playing it cool or keeping her cards close to her chest. She wanted to see me, and she wasn't afraid to say so. By the time my plane landed back home, I was exhausted but excited. We'd planned to meet that very evening, a casual dinner, just the two of us. She was thrilled when I told her I'd booked a spot at her favorite restaurant. "I can't wait," she'd said. Finally. But as I sat there, scrolling through my phone at the table, something felt off. She hadn't shown up. I checked the time, 15 minutes late. Then 30. An hour. I sent her a message. "Hey, everything okay? I'm here." No response. I called. Straight to voicemail. The waiter passed by for the third time, offering me a sympathetic smile as I fiddled with my drink. By the time I'd paid the bill for a dinner I never ate, it was clear. I'd been stood up. As I walked out into the night, confusion gave way to frustration. This was the same woman who'd spent 3 weeks texting me nonstop, counting down the days until we could see each other again. If she didn't want to meet, why not just ghost me during my trip? Why wait until the moment I was back to disappear? I tried to laugh it off on the ride home, but it stung. It wasn't just about the wasted evening. It was the way she'd vanished without a word, leaving me to wonder what I'd done wrong. For days, I replayed every conversation in my head, searching for some clue, some warning sign I might have missed. But there was nothing. And then, just when I'd resigned myself to never hearing from her again, she popped back into my life like nothing had happened. 3 months later, it was a random Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a notification. Her name lit up my screen like a ghost from the past. "Hi," the message read. "How've you been?" I stared at the screen, disbelief mixing with annoyance. "Hi." That was it. No explanation, no apology, just a casual greeting, as though she hadn't left me sitting alone at a table, wondering if she'd been hit by a bus or abducted by aliens. Against my better judgment, I opened the message. A second one followed. "Sorry I didn't reply that day. Things have been pretty busy lately." Pretty busy? For 3 months? I didn't know whether to laugh or throw my phone across the room. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her wonder how it felt to be met with silence. But another part of me, the curious, glutton for punishment part, wanted answers. Instead of replying right away, I set my phone down and went about my day, trying to figure out how to respond. What could I even say? That her sudden reappearance was as baffling as her disappearance? That I'd moved on, but a small part of me still wanted to understand what the hell had happened? By the time I picked up my phone again, I'd settled on something simple. "Busy for 3 months, huh?" I typed, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "That's one hell of a schedule." I hit send and waited. Her reply came quickly, as if she'd been sitting there, phone in hand, anticipating my response. "I know it sounds bad," she wrote. "I just had a lot going on, but I really wanted to reach out." And that was it. No further explanation, no real effort to repair the damage. Just a vague excuse, and the implication that I should be thrilled she'd decided to message me at all. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, though I had every right to be, but because I realized something in that moment. Some people don't value your time the way they should. They're all in until they're not, and when they leave, they don't think about the wreckage they've left behind. That was the last I heard from her. I deleted her number that day, along with the app. I'd always been the type to give people the benefit of the doubt, but this experience taught me a valuable lesson. Not everyone deserves it. The truth is, I'll never know why she ghosted me that night, or why she thought she could casually walk back into my life months later. But I do know one thing: sometimes the best response is no response at all. Because when someone shows you who they are, it's up to you whether you let them stick around to do it again. Dating, they say, is a journey of trial and error, a road paved with awkward silences, mismatched energies, and if you're lucky, the occasional spark. But sometimes, the road leads straight to disaster. And this was a masterclass in how not to date. It started with a message. He seemed normal enough, or so I thought. Polite, articulate, and keen to meet. When he suggested lunch at a casual spot near his condo, I agreed. I was going to be in the area anyway, so I even offered to pick him up. It felt like a generous gesture at the time. After all, how bad could it be? I arrived at the car park below his condo 5 minutes early, texting to let him know I was there. "Be right down," he replied. I settled into my seat, thinking it'd be a quick wait. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. By the 15-minute mark, I was tapping the steering wheel, my patience wearing thin. The sun blazed down, turning my car into an oven. I debated texting him again, but before I could, he finally appeared, strolling casually toward the car as if he hadn't just kept me waiting for 20 minutes. "Hey," he said, sliding into the passenger seat. No apology, no explanation, just a breezy smile, as if I were his personal chauffeur. My jaw tightened, but I forced a polite nod. First impressions weren't everything, right? I hoped lunch would redeem the situation. Spoiler, it didn't. The restaurant was nice, cozy, with an open terrace and the hum of quiet conversation. As soon as we were seated, he launched into a monologue about himself. His job, his hobbies, his gym routine, his childhood memories, it all poured out like a broken faucet. I nodded and smiled, trying to interject here and there, but he didn't seem to notice. Or care. The food arrived, and I dug in, grateful for the distraction. Meanwhile, he poked at his plate absent-mindedly, still talking. Bite after bite, I worked through my main course, listening to stories I hadn't asked for and didn't care to hear. He, on the other hand, barely touched his meal, 2 bites, maybe 3 at most, before continuing his one-man show. By the time I'd finished eating, I'd had enough. I needed an out, and fast. "Sorry," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence, "but I just remembered my mum needs the car soon. I'll have to head off after this." He nodded absent-mindedly, as if my words barely registered. When the check arrived, I reached for my wallet, out of habit more than anything else. "Let's split it," I offered, already calculating his share in my head. He blinked at me. "Oh," he said, patting his pockets. I didn't bring my wallet. Of course he didn't. I swallowed my irritation, plastered on a tight smile, and paid the bill. By this point, I just wanted to leave. Surely, he'd at least offer to pay me back later. But no, he simply thanked me and walked back to the car, still talking as if nothing had happened. The drive back to his condo was silent, save for his occasional comments about traffic and the weather. I dropped him off, muttered a quick goodbye, and sped off, relieved to finally be free of his company. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. A few days later, I messaged him, asking for his half of the bill. I thought it'd be a simple transaction. Instead, it turned into a game of cat and mouse. He'd reply with vague excuses. "Oh, I'll transfer it soon." But the payment never came. It took multiple reminders and far more effort than it was worth to get him to settle up. By then, I'd already written the date off as a total disaster. I didn't bother texting him again, and I assumed he felt the same. Surely, he knew it had gone horribly wrong. Surely, he wouldn't want to see me again. I was wrong. Weeks later, just as I'd pushed the memory of that train wreck from my mind, my phone buzzed with a message. It was him. "Hey, hope you're doing well. Want to grab lunch sometime?" I stared at the screen, dumbfounded. Lunch? Lunch? Was he serious? Did he think I'd forgotten the 20-minute wait, the endless monologue, the unpaid bill? Or worse, did he think any of that was acceptable? I didn't reply. What could I possibly say? "No thanks, I'd rather eat alone in silence than endure another date with you." Instead, I left the message on read and moved on with my life. Some dates are awkward, some are forgettable, and some are downright awful. But this was a lesson. Never offer to pick someone up on a first date. Never assume someone will be self-aware enough to realize how badly they've screwed up. And most importantly, never settle for someone who treats your time like it's disposable. Because the truth is, the right person won't keep you waiting. They'll value your effort, respect your time, and meet you halfway. And if someone doesn't, well, there's only one place to leave them, on read, where they belong. I met her at Starbucks on an unassuming Thursday night. The city had already begun to settle into its quiet hum, the streets less chaotic but still alive in that uniquely nocturnal way. We had been chatting online for weeks, and after some playful back and forth about who owed whom a coffee, we finally made plans to meet. She suggested Starbucks, a safe, no-frills choice. I agreed, nervous but excited. When she walked in, I knew it was her immediately. She had this presence, calm but confident, like she didn't need to try to impress anyone, but still managed to light up the room. She spotted me sitting by the corner table, clutching my drink like a lifeline, and offered a warm smile as she made her way over. "Hey," she said casually, setting her bag down. "Sorry I'm a bit late. Work ran over." "No worries," I replied, trying not to sound too eager. "Glad you made it." The next 2 hours flew by. We talked about everything, our jobs, travel, the weird quirks of city life. She had a way of making every topic interesting, her laughter infectious, and her energy magnetic. By the time the baristas started stacking chairs and wiping down counters, I didn't want the night to end. "Want me to walk you back to the bus interchange?" I offered, trying to keep the casualness in my voice. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Sure, why not?" The air was cool and quiet as we walked, our footsteps echoing faintly against the empty streets. The conversation slowed, becoming softer, more personal. She told me about her childhood, the things she loved, the dreams she was chasing. I told her things I hadn't planned to share, how I'd been burned in past relationships, how I wasn't sure if I was even ready to try again. By the time we reached the interchange, the electronic timetable overhead flashed ominously. The last buses of the night were about to leave. She glanced at the time and let out a soft gasp. "Crap, it's the last one," she said, already backing away. "I gotta run. Bye." And just like that, she was gone. She dashed toward her bus, her bag swinging wildly behind her, leaving me standing there in a stunned silence. I stared after her, trying to process how quickly the moment had ended. 1 second, we were deep in conversation. The next, I was alone in a nearly deserted bus terminal. Then it hit me. My bus. I fumbled for my phone, checking the time. The realization dawned on me like a bad punchline. In all the effort to get her safely to her bus, I had missed mine. Panic set in as I opened the ride-hailing app. Maybe a grab would save me. But the surge prices? Astronomical. Midnight was a cruel mistress, and I wasn't about to fork over my week's worth of coffee money for a 10-minute ride. I looked around, hoping for a miracle. None came. The streets were empty, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of a city winding down for the night. Resigned, I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking. 5 kilometers. That's how far I had to go. 5 lonely, aching kilometers under dim streetlights, the occasional car whizzing past me as if to mock my predicament. The first kilometer wasn't so bad. I still had adrenaline from the date, my thoughts replaying her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. By the second kilometer, my enthusiasm started to wane. The quietness of the streets grew oppressive, and the ache in my legs began to creep in. I considered stopping, sitting down somewhere to catch my breath, but the thought of lingering in the eerie silence pushed me forward. By the 3rd kilometer, I was muttering under my breath. "This is ridiculous. Why didn't I check the time? Who even forgets about their own bus? Unbelievable." But somewhere between the 4th and 5th kilometer, something shifted. As the ache in my legs grew sharper and the cool night air nipped at my cheeks, I couldn't help but laugh. The whole situation was absurd. Here I was, trudging through the city like some sleep-deprived explorer, all because of a girl I'd just met. And yet, I didn't regret it. Not one bit. When I finally stumbled through my front door, exhausted and half-frozen, I checked my phone. A single message lit up the screen. "Hey, did you make it home? Thanks again for walking me. I had a great time tonight," smiley face. I stared at the message for a moment, the ache in my legs suddenly forgotten. A smile crept across my face as I typed back, "Yeah, made it home. Had a great time too. Let's do it again soon." We did do it again. And again. Late-night coffee dates turned into dinner plans, which turned into weekend adventures. Each meeting brought something new, a deeper connection, a stronger bond. She became my safe place, my confidant, my everything. And now, she's my wife. Sometimes, when we're sitting on the couch, sharing a quiet moment after a long day, she'll tease me about that night. "You looked so lost when I ran for the bus," she'll say, laughing. "Like a puppy that didn't know where to go. And you left me there." I'll retort, pretending to be offended. "Do you know how far I had to walk?" 5 kilometers, she'll say, grinning. "And it was worth every step, wasn't it?" It was. Because love doesn't always arrive wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it comes disguised as a late-night coffee date, a missed bus, and a long, lonely walk home. But in the end, it's the journey that makes it worth it. And this journey? It's one I'd take 1,000 times over. The world of online dating is like walking into a lottery, full of unpredictable outcomes. You swipe, you chat, and if you're lucky, you strike gold. Or so I thought. When I matched with her on the app, it felt promising. Our banter flowed effortlessly. She laughed at my jokes, I laughed at hers, and for a moment, it seemed like we had real chemistry. After a week of chatting, we agreed to meet. The plan was simple: dinner at a cozy spot near the city. As I got ready, I told myself this could be something. But deep down, I had no idea what I was about to walk into. When she arrived, she looked just like her photos, pretty, well-dressed, and confident. I greeted her with a smile and some light conversation, but almost immediately something felt off. As we sat down and browsed the menu, I tried to steer the conversation. "So," I began, "what's been the highlight of your week?" She barely looked up. "Nothing much." Undeterred, I pressed on. "What about your hobbies? Anything fun you've been into lately?" "Don't have any," she replied, her voice flat and uninterested. I laughed nervously, hoping to lighten the mood. "Wow, no hobbies at all. You must have something you enjoy." "Not really," she said, shrugging, her eyes drifting to her phone for a brief second. I could feel the energy draining from me. Every question I asked was met with the same lukewarm responses. No enthusiasm, no curiosity, no effort to meet me halfway. I was carrying the entire conversation, and it was getting heavier with each passing minute. Then she dropped the bombshell. "So, how much do you earn?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp and direct. I blinked, taken aback. "That's kind of a personal question for a first date, don't you think?" "Why so secretive?" she sneered, leaning back in her chair. "Just share only, cannot ice it?" Red flags unfurled like a parade in my head. There's no faster way to kill the vibe than to turn a date into an interrogation about finances. Still, I tried to handle it diplomatically. "I'm just not comfortable discussing my salary with someone I've just met," I said, keeping my tone even. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "What's the big deal? It's not like I'm asking for your bank statement." I forced a smile, but in my heart, I already knew. This wasn't going anywhere. The connection I'd hoped for was as lifeless as the conversation. But before I could politely suggest we cut the night short, she hit me with another jab. "Can't even share your salary?" "What's the point?" she said, smirking. "Okay, Laura, no date, no date." Her words stung, but I kept my composure. "Fair enough," I said. "If that's how you feel, no problem." In an impulsive move, one I still can't quite explain, I decided to reveal my last payslip. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I just wanted to make a point. Either way, I let her see the numbers, and her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of interest. "Wah," she said, leaning closer. "That's a super high pay. You're lucky." I shrugged, hoping we could just move on. But she wasn't done yet. As the date dragged on, the energy shifted. She wasn't interested in getting to know me any better. Instead, she fixated on what she could gain. When the bill arrived, her entitlement reached its peak. "You can pay for mine," she said, sliding the check toward me. "After all, you're earning so much." I stared at her, stunned by her audacity. "Sorry, but I'm only paying for my part," I replied firmly. "This isn't a date anymore, remember?" She raised an eyebrow. "Wah, so stingy." I could feel my patience slipping away. "It's not about being stingy," I said. "This was supposed to be a date, where we both make an effort. But clearly, that's not what's happening here." Without waiting for her response, I paid my share, around $25, and left. As I walked out of the restaurant, the tension in my chest began to ease, replaced by a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Looking back, I laugh at how ridiculous the entire evening was. From her disinterest in anything personal to her fixation on my finances, it was a masterclass in how quickly a promising connection can crash and burn. But if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. No matter how good things seem online, the real test is always in person. And sometimes, the people who seem perfect on screen turn out to be anything but. So to anyone out there navigating the dating minefield, take this as a cautionary tale. Stay true to yourself, set boundaries, and never let anyone make you feel like your worth is tied to a number on a payslip. Because the right person, they'll see your value long before they ask about your salary. There's a fine line between a memorable encounter and one that leaves you questioning everything. This was the latter, a whirlwind of confusion, unease, and eventually, a kind of madness I'd only seen in movies. It started innocently enough, a simple compliment that led to something I could never have anticipated. It was a cold afternoon, the kind where you bury your hands deep into your pockets and tuck your chin into your jacket to escape the wind. I was walking through campus, lost in thought, when I felt a light tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see a girl standing there, her cheeks flushed from the chill, a shy smile on her lips. "Hey," she said, her voice soft and a little shaky. I just wanted to say I really like your shirt." I blinked, momentarily thrown off. I was wearing a jacket, so the shirt wasn't even visible. Still, she seemed nice enough, if a little nervous. Her eyes darted around like she was afraid of being caught saying something embarrassing. She was good-looking, too, pretty in a natural, unassuming way. I smiled back, brushing it off as a harmless moment. "Thanks," I said. "I appreciate it." She lingered for a second longer than expected, then nodded and quickly walked away. I didn't think much of it, just another random encounter in a busy day. But later, as I was leaving campus, she approached me again, this time more confident. "Hey," she said, stopping me mid-step. "Can I get your number? You seem cool, and I'd like to get to know you." It caught me off guard, but her directness was refreshing. I figured why not? We exchanged numbers, and within half an hour she texted me. The conversation started light, casual questions about hobbies, music, and school. She seemed eager, almost overly so, but I chalked it up to first-day nerves. Then came the curveball. "Will you be my boyfriend?" she asked, barely 30 minutes into our first conversation. I laughed out loud, thinking it was a joke. But her next message was dead serious. "I really think we have a connection. Please say yes." It was such a bizarre, surreal moment that I found myself agreeing without thinking. Sure," I typed back, still trying to process what was happening. Maybe she was just excited? I told myself to give her the benefit of the doubt. I shouldn't have. The video started shortly after. Out of nowhere, my phone buzzed with a message from her. Attached was a video of her singing, a shaky, off-key rendition of some pop song I didn't recognize. "Do you like it?" she asked. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. The singing was not good, but I didn't want to hurt her feelings, so I replied with a generic, "Yeah, sounds great." She sent another video, then another, each one worse than the last. After each one, she'd ask, "Do you think I'm cute? Do you like it?" Her texts became relentless, bombarding me with question after question. "Do you love me?" she asked. I stared at my phone, feeling the walls close in. We'd been dating for less than an hour, and already she was dropping the L word. She asked again and again, her messages piling up like a landslide. I felt trapped, suffocated by the intensity of her neediness. I decided it was time to end it. That night, I messaged her, telling her as gently as I could that this wasn't working. I tried to explain that we'd rushed into things, that we didn't really know each other, and that I wasn't ready for this level of intensity. Surprisingly, she took it semi-decently. "Okay," she replied. "I get it. Sorry for being too much." Relieved, I thought that was the end of it. But the next day, the truth came out. Word spread quickly around campus that she had been doing this to other guys, approaching them randomly, jumping into relationships within hours, and overwhelming them with her clinginess. It was like she was trying to find anyone who would give her the attention she craved, no matter how fleeting or superficial. By the time I heard about her, her reputation had already caught up with her. The guys she approached had started warning others, and soon enough, she ran out of willing participants. But instead of reflecting on her actions, she spiraled. A week later, I heard she had left town abruptly. No one knew where she'd gone until the rumors started trickling in. She'd jumped in front of a car, apparently in a desperate cry for attention. Miraculously, she survived with only minor injuries, but the incident cemented her reputation as the crazy girl. It's been years since that wild encounter, but I still think about her sometimes. Not with anger or frustration, but with a kind of sadness. Beneath all the chaos, I think she was just lonely. Someone looking for connection in all the wrong ways, hoping that sheer intensity could fill the void inside her. It was a surreal experience, one I'll never forget. And if it taught me anything, it's this. Sometimes, what seems harmless at first can quickly turn into something you're not prepared for. And when you see red flags, don't ignore them. Trust your gut and walk away, because some people's storms are bigger than you can handle. High school relationships are supposed to be simple. Sweet, even. A whirlwind of notes passed between classes, Friday night movies, and long phone calls filled with endless dreams about the future. At least, that's what I thought when I started dating her. She was smart, ambitious, and full of this quiet confidence that made me feel like anything was possible. For 3 months, we were inseparable, or so I thought. I never imagined how quickly things could unravel. The day I got my college acceptance letter was one of the happiest moments of my life. I had been dreaming of this since I was a kid, picturing myself walking through those ivy-covered halls, the weight of ambition and opportunity pressing against my chest. It wasn't just a goal, it was my everything. The moment I opened the letter, I didn't even think. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to her house, my hands shaking with excitement. She answered the door with her usual soft smile, but when I told her the news, something in her expression faltered. "That's amazing," she said, but her voice sounded distant. Forced. I didn't pay it much attention at the time. Maybe she was tired or distracted. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. We celebrated that night, pizza, a movie, the usual teenage version of a big night out. She was quieter than usual, but I chalked it up to nerves. We'd both been waiting on college decisions, and I assumed her letters would bring good news too. After all, she was taking 2 language courses, 3 AP classes, and her grades were stellar. There was no reason for her not to get into her top picks. But a couple of weeks later, everything came crashing down. She called me late one night, her voice trembling. "We need to talk," she said. My stomach tightened. Those words never mean anything good. The next day, I drove to her house, a pit of dread settling in my chest. She greeted me at the door, but the usual warmth in her eyes was gone. She led me to the couch and sat down, wringing her hands. "I didn't get in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked. "What do you mean?" "Every college I applied to," she continued, "rejected me, except for the community college nearby." I was stunned. How was that even possible? She was one of the smartest people I knew, disciplined and determined. Her application should have been a slam dunk. "That doesn't make any sense," I said, leaning forward. "Your grades, your classes, you worked so hard." "I know," she snapped, cutting me off. Tears welled in her eyes, and I immediately backed off. This wasn't about logic or fairness. This was about the crushing weight of disappointment, and I didn't know how to fix it. "It's fine," she said after a long pause, brushing her tears away. "I've been thinking about it, and I have a plan." Her words hung in the air, thick with anticipation. "Okay," I said cautiously. "What's the plan?" "We're moving to Florida," she announced, her voice steady now, almost determined. "My grandmother has an extra room. We can live there and apply to colleges down south. Together." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "Wait, what?" "I can't go to some stupid community college," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm better than that. We'll move to Florida. It'll be a fresh start." I laughed nervously, hoping to lighten the mood. "Florida? Are you serious? We've only been dating for a few months." Her jaw tightened. "So what? We're good together. Why wouldn't we do this?" "Because I'm not moving to Florida," I said firmly. "I've been dreaming about this college since I was a kid. I'm not giving that up." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw something in her I hadn't noticed before, something sharp and unrelenting. "So you're choosing a school over me?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm choosing my future. This has nothing to do with you. We can still be together. I'll come back for breaks. We'll make it work." "No," she said, cutting me off again. "That's not good enough. If you really cared about me, you'd come with me." I sat back, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're asking me to throw away everything I've worked for. That's not fair." She scoffed. "Life isn't fair. You think I wanted to get rejected from every school I applied to. That's not the same thing," I said, my voice rising. "This isn't about bad luck. This is about you trying to control my life." Her face twisted with frustration. "Fine," she said after a long silence. "Then you're making your choice." She stood up, her arms crossed, her gaze cold. "It's me or your dream school. Pick one." I stared at her, my heart sinking. There was no way this could end well, but the decision wasn't difficult. "Not really. I choose college," I said quietly. Her expression didn't change. She simply nodded and walked me to the door without another word. I drove home that night in silence, the gravity of what had just happened pressing down on me. I'd thought we had something real, something worth fighting for. But the truth was, she wasn't fighting with me. She was fighting against me, trying to turn my future into hers. Looking back, I'm glad I stood my ground. That decision shaped the course of my life. leading me to opportunities I'd only dreamed of. But every now and then, I think about that moment on her couch, when everything I thought I knew about her unraveled in an instant. Some choices are easy to make, but hard to live with. And some relationships teach you that love, no matter how intense, can't survive when it's built on ultimatums. At the time, he seemed perfectly normal, a little charming, a little mysterious, and just enough of both to make me want to keep peeling back the layers. For a month, I thought I'd found someone I could really connect with. But all it took was one morning to reveal who he truly was. We'd been dating for about 4 weeks, and everything felt fine. Not extraordinary, not life-altering, but nice enough to keep seeing where things could go. He was polite, attentive, the kind of guy who opened car doors and remembered the little details you shared offhandedly. Nothing about him screamed danger. If anything, he seemed almost too ordinary: steady job, neat apartment, predictable routines. I'd spent enough time with him to let my guard down. That's why, when he invited me to stay the night at his place, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't the first time I'd been over, but it was the first time I stayed. The evening was uneventful: dinner, a movie, the usual. He was affectionate but not overbearing, and as we fell asleep, I felt comfortable. Safe. When I woke up the next morning, everything still seemed normal. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, and I could hear the faint hum of the shower from down the hall. He was getting ready for work, and I figured I'd have a leisurely morning before heading home. No rush. He emerged from the bathroom, dressed and ready to leave. "Hey," he said, smiling as he leaned down to kiss my forehead. "I'm off. I'll see you later." "Okay," I replied, still groggy. "I'll probably head out in a bit." That's when his expression shifted. "Actually," he said, his tone careful but firm, "I need you to stay here until I get back." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He straightened, his smile disappearing entirely. "I don't like people leaving my house when I'm not here. It's a rule of mine." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. "You can trust me. I'll just let myself out and lock the door behind me." His face hardened. "No, you don't understand. I don't want you leaving without me. It's for your safety." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. The words felt wrong, rehearsed, like he'd said them before, and expected no pushback. I sat up, trying to gauge his mood. "That's a little weird, don't you think?" He shrugged, as if what he was asking was perfectly reasonable. "It's just how I do things. You'll be fine here until I get back." Before I could argue, he grabbed his bag and walked out the door. The sound of the lock turning echoed through the apartment, and suddenly, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I threw off the blanket and went to the door, my heart racing. It was locked from the outside. I tried the back door. Locked. The side door. Locked. Every exit required a key, and I didn't have one. I was trapped. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was some misguided way of protecting his home or showing he cared. Maybe it wasn't as sinister as it felt. But the more I paced the apartment, the more suffocated I became. No matter how I spun it, the reality was undeniable. He had locked me in. I checked my phone, my hands trembling. I texted him, trying to keep my tone calm. "Hey, can you unlock the door remotely or something? I need to leave." His reply was instant. "No. I told you, you need to stay until I'm back. It's for the best." For the best? My heart sank. This wasn't about trust or safety or anything remotely reasonable. This was about control. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. Panic bubbled up inside me. The thought of being trapped in someone else's space, powerless to leave, sent my mind racing with every worst-case scenario I could imagine. I didn't know what else he was capable of, and that terrified me. I started searching for ways out. The windows were latched shut, the locks too sturdy to force open. I considered calling the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Would they believe me? Or would they brush it off as some domestic misunderstanding? The thought made me feel even more isolated. Then, I remembered the fire escape. The window in the living room was the only one with access to it. I grabbed a kitchen knife, pried the latch loose, and shoved the window open. The cold morning air hit my face like a slap, but it was the first breath of freedom I'd felt all day. I climbed out carefully, gripping the metal railing, as I made my way down to the street below. Once I was out, I didn't look back. I blocked his number that same day. No explanations, no closure, nothing. He didn't deserve it. Over the next few days, friends tried to tell me it was probably just a misunderstanding, that I should hear him out. But I couldn't. The sheer audacity of locking someone in a house, turning a shared space into a prison, was unforgivable. Weeks later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd done this before. Apparently, I wasn't the first woman he'd trapped under the guise of rules or protection. It wasn't about safety, it was about control, and I had no intention of becoming another chapter in his twisted pattern. Looking back, the red flags seem obvious. He was polite, but always a little too particular about how things should be. He insisted on making the plans, choosing the places, setting the pace of the relationship. I'd mistaken it for thoughtfulness, but it wasn't. It was control disguised as care. That experience taught me to trust my instincts, to listen to the tiny voice that whispers, something isn't right. Because when someone tries to control your freedom, no matter how subtle or sweet they seem, it's not love. It's a cage, and I will never be caged again. First dates are like rolling the dice. Sometimes you win, sometimes you get a story that haunts you forever. I went into this one with cautious optimism. After a week of chatting online, he seemed charming, quirky, and surprisingly deep. The kind of guy who quoted Rumi and sent playlists tailored to my taste. He suggested we meet for a walk in my favorite park, a place I knew like the back of my hand. It seemed safe, simple, and impossible to mess up. I wasn't looking for a soulmate that day. I just wanted a decent conversation, and maybe a new friend. What I got was something else entirely. I spotted him waiting near the entrance to the park. Tall, lanky, dressed in an oversized trench coat that seemed more suited to a costume party than a casual date. He smiled when he saw me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought, maybe he's just eccentric. Maybe this will be fun. "Hey," I said, smiling back as I approached. "Nice to finally meet you." He nodded, his eyes flickering with an intensity one hadn't noticed in his photos. "The energy here is incredible," he said, gesturing dramatically toward the trees. "I can feel it buzzing all around us." I blinked. Sure. It's a beautiful spot." "It's more than beautiful," he corrected, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's powerful. This park is a convergence point for magical energy." I let out a nervous laugh, hoping he was joking. He wasn't. For the next 20 minutes, he launched into an elaborate monologue about ley lines, astral projections, and his supposed psychic abilities. "Most people don't understand," he said, glancing at me for validation. "But I can sense things, see things most can't. I'm attuned to the universe." I nodded along, not wanting to be rude, but internally, I was screaming. This wasn't quirky, it was bizarre. Still, I decided to give him a chance. Maybe he was just nervous. Maybe he was trying too hard to impress me. "Okay," I said, trying to change the subject. "So, what do you do for fun?" "Hobbies." "Hobbies?" He tilted his head like the question confused him. "I guess you could say magic is my hobby." "Right?" I said, my voice tight. "Of course." He launched into another story, this time about a time he supposedly banished an evil entity from a friend's apartment. He described it in excruciating detail, his hands moving in exaggerated gestures to demonstrate the rituals he'd performed. I tried to steer the conversation back to reality, but he wasn't having it. The more I pushed for normal topics, the more he leaned into his delusions. At one point, he even stopped walking, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. "Can you feel that?" he asked, holding out his hand. I stared at him, bewildered. "Feel what?" "The shift in energy," he said, as if it were obvious. "Something's watching us." I looked around. Just trees, squirrels, and an old couple feeding birds. "Sure," I said weakly, resisting the urge to check the time. By the time we finished the loop, I was drained. All I wanted was to say goodbye and chalk this up as an unfortunate misstep in the world of online dating. But as we reached the parking lot, he turned to me with a sheepish smile. "Hey," he said, "this is a little awkward, but could you give me a ride to the bus station?" I frowned. "You didn't drive here?" "No," he admitted, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I don't have a car." I hesitated. I didn't want to spend another second with him, but the bus station wasn't far. Against my better judgment, I agreed. "Sure," I said. "Hop in." The ride started out quiet, almost peaceful. I told myself it would be over soon, just 5 minutes, and I'd be free. But then, halfway there, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He said, his voice tight. "Can we pull over somewhere? I really need to pee." "We're almost there," I said, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. "Can you hold it?" "I don't think so," he muttered, squirming visibly now. It's bad." I stared at the road, gripping the wheel tighter. The station was just a few blocks away. Surely he could wait. "We're almost there," I repeated, my voice strained. And then it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him freeze. His face turned red, and he let out a soft, mortified gasp. I didn't need to ask what had happened. The smell hit me like a freight train. "Oh my God," I said, pulling into the station as fast as I could. "I'm so sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I couldn't. As soon as the car came to a stop, he scrambled out, mumbling apologies as he grabbed his bag and bolted toward the station. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the wet patch on the passenger seat. I drove home with all the windows down, praying the stench wouldn't linger forever. When I got back, I scrubbed the seat until my arms ached, muttering to myself the entire time. "Never again," I said aloud, vowing to trust my instincts the next time a date seemed even slightly off. The whole experience felt surreal, like a twisted fever dream. A self-proclaimed wizard, a bizarre monologue about magical energy, and a literal accident in my car. It was the kind of story you'd expect to hear in a comedy sketch, not live through. But if there's one thing I learned from that day, it's this. Sometimes the warning signs are there from the start. And sometimes they're wearing a trench coat and claiming to feel energy shifts. Either way, it's best to walk away before the ride gets messy, literally. Some dates leave you with butterflies, others with a funny story to tell your friends. And then there are those rare, unsettling encounters that linger in your mind for all the wrong reasons. This is one of those. It started innocently enough. An online match on OkCupid, some light-hearted messages, and the usual exchange of photos. She seemed normal. Sweet, even. Her profile was charming, filled with anecdotes about her love for books, travel, and deep conversations. Her pictures? They painted her as confident and poised. So when she suggested we meet up for coffee, I thought, why not? I showed up to the cafe with low expectations but an open mind. What I got was something else entirely. The moment I saw her, I knew something was off. Her photos had been generous, to put it kindly. She looked nothing like the polished images she'd carefully curated for her profile. Now, I'm not one to judge based on appearances alone, but the discrepancy was so stark it left me reeling. Still, I decided to give her a fair chance. Maybe her personality would shine and make up for the false advertising. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Within minutes of sitting down, she launched into a monologue about her life. And I do mean monologue. There wasn't a pause or opening for me to chime in. She told me about her string of failed friendships, her constant drama, and how no one ever seemed to understand her. "I don't know why people are so fake," she said, stabbing at her muffin with a fork. "I mean, I just tell it like it is. Maybe that's why I lose friends, but I don't care." I nodded politely, my coffee suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. Every attempt I made to steer the conversation into neutral, pleasant territory was met with more tales of betrayal, misunderstandings, and grievances. She wasn't just self-absorbed, she was a vortex of negativity. 40 minutes in, I realized there was no saving this date. I didn't feel a spark, or even a faint ember of interest. I waited for a lull in her one-sided rant, and carefully navigated the exit strategy. "This has been nice," I lied, standing up and grabbing my coat. "But I think I should head out. Thanks for meeting up." She looked surprised, almost hurt, but managed to smile. "Yeah, of course. It was nice meeting you." I walked out, relieved to be free of the emotional quicksand I'd been stuck in for the past hour. But the relief was short-lived. 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed. The text read, "I've never met anyone like you. I really feel like we have something special. When can we see each other again?" I stared at my phone, dumbfounded. Had we been on the same date? I could still hear her complaints echoing in my head, her voice sharp and grating. There was no way she could have interpreted my polite disengagement as romantic interest. Still, I wanted to be kind. I replied, "Hey, I don't think we're a match, but I wish you all the best." I hit send and assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. She responded almost immediately. "What do you mean we're not a match? We got along so well. You're not like other guys." I sighed, letting her message sit unread for a while, hoping she'd take the hint. She didn't. Over the next few hours, more texts rolled in, each one more desperate than the last. "You're different. I can tell you're scared of how real this is. Why are you ignoring me?" I ignored them all. By the next day, the messages slowed, then stopped altogether. I figured she'd finally moved on and put the whole ordeal behind me. But 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed again. This time, her tone was different. Gone were the sweet, overly attached messages. In their place was a barrage of insults and accusations. Why are all guys the same? You led me on, you asshole. You should put on your CV that you're a dickhead. It's the only thing you're good at. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The sheer venom in her words caught me off guard. All this after one brief coffee date? My instinct was to defend myself, to tell her I'd been nothing but polite and upfront. But I knew better than to engage. Responding would only fuel the fire. I blocked her number, deleted the messages, and sat there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. The entire experience felt surreal, like I'd stepped into a soap opera I didn't audition for.